Today's reading is from Rays of the One Light, Weekly Commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, Jesus warns, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them." Jesus here, as indeed many times during his teaching, counsels people to use their God-given common sense and not to rely on high-flown but undemonstrable claims. Common sense goes beyond abstract reason, for it is rooted in actual experience. Even common sense, however, is deficient when the judgment called for goes beyond sensory experience. Ultimately, what he emphasized always, therefore, was intuitive perception. Thus, he expected more of his disciples than crude common sense, and often scolded them for being too literal-minded, as he did elsewhere when they thought his statement, "I have meat to eat that you know not of," meant that he had steaks or sandwiches secreted about his person. His reference, of course, was to spiritual, not material, substance. Words, even though appearing in the scriptures, are no substitute for direct perception of truth. Therefore, the Bhagavad Gita says in the 2nd chapter, "The sage who knows God has as little need for the scriptures as one might have for a pond when the whole land is covered in flood." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Good morning, everyone. I thought to approach the subject this morning by focusing on two aspects. One is the need to go by our own experience, ideally direct experience, and the other is the intuitive perception, of course, that the reading was talking about. I had an occasion recently. I was called into jury duty. And it was a day when there were hundreds, literally over 200 people were in the room called to jury duty, and they had many trials starting, and they carved us up, and I was sent into one courtroom with about 30 people, and they were going to narrow us down to 13. So it was a criminal case, actually. It was assault. And there was a man with a ponytail who was the defendant, and a woman defender and a woman prosecutor. And the defending and prosecuting attorneys then asked questions of us jurors to try to whittle us down. And the defending attorney asked, if I decide not to call up my client to testify, what will you think about that? And different people answered, and when it was my turn, I said, well, I would wonder about that. My mind would wonder about that. Why? And she said, if the judge tells you not to wonder about that, would you do that? And I said, no, how could I? It's my mind. And I didn't say this, but for 45 years, I've been meditating and training myself to work more by intuition, which is as much what is not said as what is said, and vibration and body language and many other factors. So of course, I'm going to lean on that experience. And there's nothing that can tell me to sort of break that away. It's a very mental process, this whole legal thing. But so anyway, I realized that we have to go with our own experience. There was something I came upon, I shared with you all through the years, said something like, we've created 35 million laws to be able to enact the 10 Commandments. That's how complicated we get when we work with our mind alone and we forget to call on intuition and feeling and direct experience of things. It's very, very prevalent, especially in the West. I had an uncle who was a botanist, and he had a PhD in botany. He taught at the university level. He was called from governments all over the world, invited him to come. He specialized in tropical botany to help them figure out how to grow tropical kinds of fruits and plants in their countries, both hemispheres. Very, very bright man. And he was visiting us once in Southern California we had immigrated when I was 10 from Holland, and he was visiting us while we still lived down there. We were driving on a highway, and both sides of the highway was lined with eucalyptus trees. And someone in the car commented on the fragrance of the eucalyptus. And he said, no, that can't be eucalyptus. They only grow in Australia. Or something like that. And we said, well, there were 50 eucalyptus trees there. No, can't be eucalyptus. Just can't be. And that's what happens when, we go with sort of what we've learned in books and through words and through outer things rather than from experience. It's pretty crazy. Swami Kriyananda, who's Ananda's founder and direct disciple of Yogananda, whose teachings we practice here, he said when he was a young man especially, he went by intellect. So when he first came upon Autobiography of a Yogi, he read it, he just inhaled it practically. He read it so quickly and with such fervor. It answered all of his questions about truth that he was seeking and about God. He said, but he had to confess when he got to page 6 and Lahiri Mahashaya was manifesting himself in a wheat field, he had to sort of put that on a shelf. He couldn't relate to that with his intellect, with his mind, but he had enough experience of peace and power and rightness and truth in the vibration and the message of the book that he was able to discern enough to set that aside for a while, thinking, maybe later I'll understand this. For now, I'm just going to put it aside. And that's the kind of thing we want to learn to discern. I know for myself, when I first came to this path, I was 19 years old. And I was born, as many of you know, in an agnostic Jewish family. And I had read the Autobiography of a Yogi. I was deeply moved by it. I was told about Ananda. I went up there. It was very early on. It was very rustic. It was very new. And it was at what some of you who've been to Ananda in California know to be the old retreat, and went into the temple there and came upon these gentlemen on the altar. And the first thought in my mind was, and I had read the book, so I knew what it was about, but the thought in my mind when I walked into that temple was, my family's going to kill me. You know? They are not going to be able to relate to this. And yet, for me, it was a powerful experience, and I knew I wanted that peace and that calmness and that connection with the divine that's within me. And so I went against the grain of my upbringing to follow my experience, to go with my own direct experience and not just that only of my conditioning. And when at some point a little later on, Riemann and I were married there at Ananda Village at the old retreat and outside. It was the hottest day of the year, 117 in the shade. Swami Kriyananda came dressed he was officiating. He had a dhoti on, an Indian dhoti, and no shirt because it was hot. So his Catholic parents and my Jewish parents were there for a yogic wedding with a Swami who was half dressed, it would seem to them. And yet, my mother afterwards said to me, she said, I don't know what this is all about, she said, but he has a sense of humor, so it's got to be okay. And I thought, good for her, she always had a good intuition. Good for her. She felt that, she also felt his dignity and his refinement and that sense of humor combined. He didn't take himself too seriously. It's got to be okay, notwithstanding how it flies in the face of everything that you've known. And that's the way we want to try to live, to go by our inner experience, our own inner experience. I know even in the context of living at Ananda, after our children were born and we were raising them, Riemann and I both worked for Ananda to serve this work. And Ananda pays what we like to call renunciate wages, very, very simple salaries. And so there were only a handful of parents, less than one handful of parents, where both husband and wife were working, serving Ananda and earning their salaries with Ananda. All the others were either one or both were having outside jobs to be able to support the families. And we had a fair amount of peer pressure, you might say, from those families. How are you going to put your kids through college? What if they have needs? You're not going to be able to do that on these salaries. But Riemann and I just knew that, faith is really the most practical choice to make, the most practical life to live. And that somehow things would work out the way they're supposed to work out if we gave 7,000% of our energy to try to serve God and our ideals. And in fact, the children grew up and went to good universities and had good educations, and everything turned out just fine. With hindsight, we can say that. We didn't know that necessarily in an outward way at that time, but we knew it inside, that it would work out just fine. I remember working with Swami Kriyananda on the publishing of his books. I was coordinating those activities, and at first I knew absolutely nothing about publishing. And one of the things he said to me, one of the pieces of advice he gave me, he says, don't look to the experts in the field of publishing. He said, go inside, ask God what to do. And that was an incredibly valuable lesson. In fact, in doing that, in short time, we developed a way, this was in the 80s, we developed a way, there had been a motorhome donated to Ananda. We had people 2 at a time, members of Ananda, go out. We crossed the country with that motorhome. They took turns. Every month we would change crews, and then they'd keep going. And they basically opened up about 2,000 bookstore accounts with, presenting our books to the buyers back in those days. And the so-called experts in the publishing field were turning to us and saying, how did you do that? That's so hard to do. Through distributors and other methods where you don't have that direct contact, you get, different results in your sales. So, and I also learned that principle is the important principle. We live in a funny world, and we educate ourselves, and we get our masters and our PhDs, and make our millions, and therefore we're experts. And there's sort of a folly that goes with that, because we're still filters. We're seeing what we want to hear. We're hearing what we want to hear. We have our foibles. We make our mistakes, And when you really penetrate that outer veneer of expertise, you see just a human being trying to do their best in that arena. And there might be something you could actually learn from them. I liked to figure out how the publishing world works so that I could figure out how to go around it to get done what I needed to get done. There's ways in which that knowledge can be helpful, but not to sort of take it on as, well, that has to be how I do it, and that has to be how it works. It's not necessarily that way. Yogananda said to his disciples, and Kriyananda shared this, when he would ask them to develop some aspect of the work, he said, don't look at how others are doing it. Go inside. Ask God how to do it. It's so important. He had a body of teaching on teaching children. Yogananda, actually, the first thing he did in India was develop a school for children, right? And he had certain principles on which he based that school. He didn't flush it out with masses of curriculum that we could draw on. It would have been great, but he didn't. But he had the certain principles. And then Kriyananda took that and developed it further into the Education for Life system. And he said Kriyananda said the one arena that he hoped would be developed that he didn't have the karma for, the knowledge of, is the healing arena. And that Yogananda has an entire body of teachings on healing, but not to turn to all kinds of other methods of healing, but to look at the body of teaching that he gave and meditate on it and go within, and then help to present it in such a way that others can relate to it, turn it into a form and give it some structure so that others can relate to it. But go to the source. Don't, Kriyananda didn't go to see how Montessori and what are the other ones called? What's that? Waldorf and the other systems work. They're great systems. But he didn't turn there to figure out what Yogananda had in mind for an education system. He went within, knowing the teachings and then studying them deeply, contemplating them, and then asking for that divine guidance. And so that's what we want to do in our lives. Our farmers here in Seattle at Camino Island have done exactly that. The sort of predominant method of farming at Ananda to that point was, the normal organic farming, and they felt drawn to and had some experience with permaculture, and they went to that farm, which was raw land 3 years ago, and just applied themselves 700% and kept asking each day for guidance. And I didn't know how that was going to work and whether it was going to make it. There were serious questions about whether permaculture was going to be able to pay the bills and so on. And yet, it has blossomed just beautifully. And, by their fruits, and by that I don't mean just the strawberries and apples, but by the farmers themselves. There's a beauty and an attunement that you feel, and it's working against all odds. Within 1 year, they were covering the bills against all odds in the farming industry. And so by tuning in and asking God, which I know they do, they meditate and they go within, and each day they say, what is trying to happen today? We develop that intuition in meditation. Intuition is the soul's power to know God. And last night, Justin spoke eloquently about the Greek know thyself. Know thyself. Swami Kriyananda wanted us to use that as a part of our name of the East-West bookshops, because everything in that store is so that people can find their way to know thyself, to know the divine that is within them. And meditation is a powerful tool. Intuition, Yogananda says, is strengthened and grows and blossoms at the end of our meditation practices when we're sitting in the silence and we're still. We've stilled our minds and hearts as much as we are able, which isn't perfect, but to the extent of that stillness, we begin to develop that intuition. And Sri Yukteswar tells Yogananda in his autobiography that in meditation, God will respond adequately to all our difficulties. Respond adequately to all our difficulties. It doesn't mean it's going to look the way we want it to look necessarily, or think it's going to look, but it will be adequate to the circumstance. In other words, appropriate to the circumstance. The divine responds when we want to commune, and in the stillness of meditation, in prayer we're talking, in meditation we're listening for that response. We begin to develop that intuition, and then we have to trust that intuition. It doesn't mean it's going to be 100% accurate, because we are filters and we're not perfect and we may be wrong at times. But we have to learn to trust it by acting on it. We take steps and act on it and test it and see, okay, I'm going to take this first step and see where that goes, because that's where it's guiding me. And in that process, we know, we learn, we feel and receive that divine response. It's like I was saying in the little email about Sunday service that went out. We want to learn to go within for it, and when the book and the bird disagree, go with the bird. Go with our experience.
Let's have a moment of silence as we listen to these words from Yogananda's collection of prayer demands, Whispers from Eternity. In the furnace of trials, the ore of my life is being purified. The fire of experience melts away all my delusions' dross. O divine artisan, burn away all my impurities. Bring out in me the steel of endurance and hone it to a fine edge by deep calmness. Forge in me from the tempered steel of mental balance sharp swords of self-control and firm tenacity. With the weapon of inner equilibrium, teach me to fight every enemy of distraction. Now we'd like to give you an